Okay, thanks everybody. I'm sure you'll agree there was some rather tasty and interesting coffees on there to taste. Hopefully that's got the blood moving a little bit, shaking the legs, had a little time for a quick toilet break. We're going to have one more talk now before lunch. This one's a little bit longer, so I'm anticipating a few more questions, so definitely prepare for them. But no hanging around. I'm running a tight ship on this one. MT would be proud of me. I will hand over to Julia. Julia is from Toddy, but she's going to be talking about the CVA, so the Coffee Value Assessment from the SCA. Julia.
So as Jamie mentioned, my name is Julia. I've been in and out of the coffee industry since I was a teenager. I got a summer job when I was a teenager as a barista, and knew very little about coffee, but I knew on my first day that it was for me. I did a training shift. It was about 2 to 3 hours, and I learned how to pull shots of espresso. And in my first shift, I consumed, I think, 6 double shots, and could barely drive home. So it was a challenging but eye-opening day, and I've been in love with coffee ever since. Now, it took me a few years to build up my caffeine tolerance so I could do an amazing cupping like we just had. But immediately, I fell in love with the people of coffee and how coffee brings us all together and connects cultures all around the world and teaches us stories and gives us an opportunity to connect. So these days, I lead a company called Toddy. We're based in Loveland, Colorado in the US, and we manufacture cold brewing equipment. And you might wonder, what does this talk have anything to do with cold brew equipment? And we'll get there. So our business for years was really focused on cold brew equipment for the home user, starting in the 1960s, and then it grew to the cafe user and roaster, et cetera. And as we got more and more sophisticated into developing equipment, we realized that we really needed to have an understanding of not just cold brew coffee, but of coffee in general and coffee quality. And we became learners of coffee, and we transitioned that into educators of coffee. And what I love so much is the opportunity to learn new things and teach things and apply it to all areas of coffee. Again, making those connections with people. So as my current role with the SCA is I'm a board member. So I serve on the Specialty Coffee Association Board of Directors, and I'm also what's called an ambassador for the Coffee Value Assessment. And so we'll talk the rest of the presentation about the Coffee Value Assessment, how it came to be, and how it applies to everyone in this room, potentially, and along the whole value chain. So let's start with 3 questions. What do you need to know about the SCA Coffee Value Assessment? So first of all, why change the cupping protocol? The protocol that's been around since 2004, I'll mention the 2004 protocol quite a bit. Why change something that is so embedded in so many of our businesses? Why bother? The second question is, what is changing, and how is it an improvement? And then I think the most important question is, who do these changes benefit? So question number 1, why is the SCA changing the cupping protocol? So the cupping protocol is really a standard. And a standard is used by the association, but as well as an industry, to have a common knowledge and common practices. Our understanding of specialty has also changed. Again, since 2004, specialty coffee was really considered as a very narrow part of what we now see as specialty coffee. For example, the 2004 form was really designed for washed green Arabicas. So what is specialty coffee? Is it a score? Is it a perception of quality? What does that actually mean? So by looking at this, Everything 80 and above is considered specialty, everything below is considered commercial, but there's so much in between of very good and outstanding. And even the coffees that we just tasted, I loved hearing the conversations and even our own preconceived notions of naturals and washed, and how some people say, well, I normally don't prefer naturals, but this coffee I like, and here's why. So let's take this as an example of how do you take something that's a vast sensory experience and distill it down into a score. So this particular visual representation is of a painting. And as you can see, there's many colors and textures and shades. And I think if you relate this to a cup that you're tasting, there's so many things that you experience in that cup. So if we take the current form, our goal is to go through and pick out the colors, so to speak. So what are the flavors? What's the brightness? What's the intensity? What's the mouthfeel? What are the defects? And you can relate to coffee by pulling out the colors of the painting, as you see here. The score is really pulling all of these colors, all of these sensory experiences together into one single color. And I think it does a pretty good representation. If you're going to distill all of the colors, all of the features of this painting into one color, the single greenish color on the side, I think, sure, it's a good representation. But if you give someone this one color, is it going to reflect back and tell them all of the experiences of the painting? And I think that's one of the challenges that we have with a single cup score, is it does give you information, but it doesn't tell you the full story of the coffee. So coffee, as we know, is much more than a score, just as the painting is much more than a single color. So let's look at the different attributes of coffee. Intrinsic attributes are material attributes within the coffee. So yes, you have the cupping score, the physical appearance, the size, grade, roast color, and the descriptive profile. What does a coffee taste like? In addition to that, and what's become so much more important over the past 20 years, are the extrinsic attributes, or the symbolic attributes of the coffees. So the origin, the certifications, the name of the farm, the brand, how it was grown, et cetera, et cetera. So the definition of specialty coffee that the Specialty Coffee Association has really worked to develop is much more than a score or a rating of quality. Specialty coffee is a coffee or coffee experience that is recognized for its distinctive attributes, resulting in higher value within the marketplace. And the goal of the Specialty Coffee Association is to make coffee better for everybody. And I love that this definition of specialty coffee really is looking at how do we define a part of the coffee industry by, yes, looking at the qualities in the cup, but the overall value that the coffee can bring to everyone in the supply chain. So the second answer to the question is our understanding and use of cupping has changed. Again, since 2004, coffee in the form was really seen as washed green Arabicas. And the way we cupped it was based on the science, both the sensory and the consumer science back then. So much has changed. There's been so much advancements in our understanding of sensory and consumer science. And we really wanted to apply those in a way that was going to be meaningful for the whole industry. So this is a study that was done with really at the start of this project. When we started asking the questions of, does cupping need to change? And if so, how and why? And so this process was done with more than 1,000, I think it was around 1,500 cuppers around the world, to really get feedback on the existing protocol and the existing form. And some of the main learnings really led to the start of the CVA process. And again, I want you to think of the coffee value assessment, this new generation of coffee sensory evaluation and cupping, is not an organization saying, hey, we're going to make a change and everyone's going to fall in line. It's really about the organization and all of the people, both the staff as well as the board and the members, saying it's time to do better. It's time to learn and adapt, and how can we work together to do that? So yeah, the learnings of this first study are as follows. The specialty coffee industry has become global and diverse since the form and the protocol were first launched in 2004. And the need for more descriptive sensory data and the data to be relevant to the cupping score has really advanced. The importance of sweetness in coffee has increased. And those of you familiar with the 2004 form, sweetness isn't on there at all. And then number 4, there are many areas of the existing form and protocol that could be improved. And in fact, the SCA gathered a wish list at the beginning of this process to say, okay, what's the most important to all of the cuppers that were involved in this study? Our understanding of sensory science has changed. There's been a lot of advancements in the past 20 years, and a lot of opportunities for us to learn about how the brain works, how sensory analysis works, in order to adapt it into something that's going to be more meaningful and more relevant to the whole industry. So as part of this process, we conducted a literature review of sensory science around the world. And so a literature review is basically someone going in, or a team of people going in and analyzing literature from all sorts of scientific articles, publications from around the world, and gathering the themes and the main takeaways and the learnings. And so what did we learn in this process? Number 1, there are 3 types of attributes that we want to be able to track: descriptive sensory attributes, affective sensory attributes, and extrinsic. So we'll go into those a little bit more in the following slides. Number 2, the latest sensory science advises against combining descriptive and affective assessment types. So think of it as multitasking. Many of us believe that we're really good at texting and driving at the same time. It turns out the neuroscience tells us we're not, and there are certain things that you're going to be a lot more effective at if you separate them. Texting, driving, keep them separate. Descriptive and affective sensory, it's really the evidence is really clear that separating those two makes us much more effective at both. So number 3, having a lexicon and references, which we now have, is a great backup to descriptive assessments. And a lexicon is a common language, so to speak. And the references, think of it as, if we all know what dark chocolate tastes like, then when we write it in our descriptive form, then we can relate that to a common understanding. Number 4, cuppers can be really good descriptive panelists. And number 5, cupping scores are ultimately an affective rating. Even if it's meant to be intersubjective, to reflect a cupper's or a market preference, affective ratings are going to be different across cuppers and specifically all over the world. And we'll have more examples of that later. So, okay, so you take this, how do you break it down? So here's a sentence that we've probably all heard in cupping rooms. And so let's break it down. I tasted 3 coffees. I liked the 3rd one. It tasted floral and sweet, and it was the best. So we don't talk a lot about discrimination in the coffee value assessment. But I think as cuppers, that's something we're all familiar with. And in fact, each of those coffees on the tables, there were 3 different cups. And the triangulation is a very common practice. So, again, is there something different? Is one cup different than the others? So I tasted 3 different coffees. I liked the third one. So this particular cupper noticed that there was something different about the third one, whether it was a triangulation or a similar cupping to what we did shortly ago. That, I heard different people preferring different cups. It tasted floral and sweet, and it was the best. So the effective, I liked the third one. It was the best. So those are personal preferences. Whereas it tasted floral and sweet, those are somewhat objective, especially if we're using the same lexicon and the same standards. We can all understand what floral and sweet tastes like. So again, as cuppers, we have this experience. Taste 3 coffees. I liked the third one because it was floral and sweet. And so this is the type of processes that we go through as coffee tasters that our new protocol is intended to address. So what does this mean? So this is a snapshot of the current form. And we just launched the new coffee value assessment as a standard. And so there's actually a couple of things in this slide that need to be in this deck that need to be updated. So this is the 2004 form. So again, the dark gray is primarily descriptive. And so in this form, it's really just the uniformity score. The light gray is primarily affective, so the subjective. And then the descriptive, the blue sections are more of the objective. So are you following me here so far? Okay, great. So with this, we're basically asking you to do all 3 assessments at once. And again, with our texting and driving analogy, it can be challenging. And how much better, how much more effective could we be? How much easier would it be to train coffee professionals if we were able to separate? So what's changing, and how are those changes an improvement? So first, there are 4 assessments instead of 2. In the 2004 system, there were 2 assessments: green grading, so moisture, size, etc., and then cupping, sensory attributes, impression of quality. Now in the new system, there are essentially 4, as well as a value discovery tool that's under development. So physical, again, moisture, size, etc. And this is mainly focused right now on Arabica, green bean buying for Arabica. And I think at some point there will be more varietal species in development. Cupping is in the middle, the descriptive sensory attributes and the affective impression of quality. And then the extrinsic that just launched in beta is the informational attributes. So the cupping is split into 2 separate assessments. So descriptive assessment, it actually just came out of beta testing last week at the World of Coffee. So what do we do with the descriptive assessment? Our goal is to record information about a coffee's sensory attributes using basic olfactory references, including fragrance, aroma, flavor, aftertaste, acidity, sweetness, and mouthfeel. So all of those things are very familiar to us. It's how we record that that's different. And so let's break it down. This is an objective test, not liking or quality. It identifies sensory attributes, ideally using a standardized familiar vocabulary, such as the World Coffee Research lexicon and the flavor wheel. It utilizes references for shared understanding, such as dark chocolate or canned blueberries. The performance can be assessed against other trained panelists. So this is the sort of thing that anyone in your company, anyone in a judging panel, for example, can be trained on. How are we going to define dark chocolate? How are we going to define blueberries, etc.? Again, it's based on the World Coffee Research Lexicon and the SCA flavor wheel. It uses check all that apply intensity, so a 1 through 15. And we believe that cuppers can act as a quasi-descriptive panel. And then data can be validated with quantitative descriptive analysis panel. So we'll get into that as some examples a little bit later. This is a slide that shows some of the development of the sensory lexicon that the World Coffee Research and SCA did. And this shows some of the references. The blueberry is actually a canned blueberry that was used as the reference for the lexicon. And there's a lot more information that you can find on the World Coffee Research website. But this was really to develop a common language that we could all use around the world to understand what these flavor attributes are. So here's a snapshot of the descriptive form. And at the end, I'll give you a QR code that will take you to the website where you can download a ton of free resources as well as learn more. But as a quick overview, the descriptive form is, your goal is to accomplish 3 things. Rate the total intensity of the combined attributes in each category. So fragrance. Is the intensity low? Is it medium? Is it high? Aroma, same thing, low, medium, high. And then number 2, choose up to the number of specific descriptors that apply in the check all that apply boxes on the left side of the form. So I'm not sure how well you can see this, but for example, are you tasting floral? Are you tasting fruity? Is that fruity a dried fruit or a citrus fruit, etc.? So it's basically you're cataloging what you're tasting and what the intensity of the flavors are, as well as the acidity, the sweetness, the mouthfeel, the aftertaste, etc. And then freely elicited written descriptors on the side. So the flavor wheel has more than 100 different flavors if you go to the outer circles. And this form has about the top dozen or so, mainly from the inner. So this allows you to check the boxes. Yep, it's in this category, and then you could put more specific notes in the side. So again, this is meant to be objective. Am I tasting fruit? Am I tasting floral? What's the intensity? And then next section. So using the other side of your brain is the affective. And again, this just came out of beta testing last week. So the goal of the affective is to take a step back and record your perception of quality. So record information about your impression of quality or hedonic preferences, liking, on a 9-point scale. One of the nice things about a 9-point scale that sensory science has taught us is there's a middle point. On one end is I don't like it at all. On the high end is, wow, this is the best I've ever had. And then somewhere in the middle, it's like, oh, it's okay. And so instead of calling this preference, the term impression of quality was chosen in part because sometimes you're assessing a coffee for your own preferences, but in other cases, you're a buyer and you're assessing for the impression of quality for your customers' preferences. So for example, you may not be a fan of washed coffees at all, but your job is to purchase a washed coffee that a specific set of customers in your market will prefer. And so you're able to use that impression of quality in order to make a meaningful assessment for them. So again, to summarize, the impression of quality is a coffee taster's opinion of the distinctiveness and desirability of a coffee sensory category, reflecting either their own preference or a known market preference. So how does this work? The impression of quality relies on your expert opinion as a coffee taster. It's an affective and therefore truly is a subjective measure. It reflects your own preference or a market preference known to you. Performance is measured by self-consistency. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the affective is knowing yourself and knowing your own preferences and really being calibrated to yourself, less so than calibrated to someone around the world who may have very different preferences for themselves as well as their market. Alignment with other cuppers is not expected or many times even desired. Based on the concept of impression of quality, again, it uses a 9-point hedonic scale, and it translates into a 100-point scale. Data can be validated by evaluating consistency over time. So how does this work? So for each section, you rate your impression of quality by filling in the bubbles in the form. So fragrance, what's my impression of quality of the coffee's fragrance? Aroma, what's my impression of quality on a 9-point scale? And then you move on to flavor, aftertaste, acidity, sweetness, and mouthfeel. So you write your final impression of quality at the end of each row. And then here's where you have an opportunity to mark any defective or non-uniform cups, which may negatively impact the score. And you can calculate the score using the SCA's Coffee Value Assessment web-based calculator. So it actually is possible to do the math yourself, and the new standard actually has a table in here where you can add up, if you'd rather do it by hand, add up all of the scores and relate it to a 100-point scale. So it's not meant to be mysterious, it's meant to be straightforward. And one of the nice things about how the calculations work is it's very applicable to web-based or app-based calculators. And so many of us in the coffee industry are moving away from paper forms into app-based calculators for our cuppings in general, and this is incredibly compatible with that. So the extrinsic assessment actually just launched in beta. They're calling it the extraordinary extrinsic. Understanding the beta is in this guide, but it's also available online. And so again, what is the extrinsic? So much of that has proven year over year to be a huge driver of the value of coffee. So that can be anything from the name of the farm, the processing method, the certifications, organic, fair trade, which has become so important to us as coffee buyers and consumers that the extrinsic assessment gives us a way to quantify that in a way that we really hadn't had access to before. So to summarize, the extrinsic assessment gives us an opportunity to record additional information about a coffee that may contribute to its value, including identity information and sustainability attributes. So in the old form, you only had this small area in the notes section to record that type of information. In the new form, there's a lot of available checkboxes, so to speak, attributes, sustainability, and others that may be important to you and your customers. This just launched from alpha to beta, which means that there's really a call for feedback on this. And if you go online to the SCA CVA site, which I'll link you to in a little bit, it'll plug you into how you can trial this and how you can provide feedback. And again, all of this coffee value assessment initiative is driven by the global coffee community. And so it's only going to work and only going to be meaningful if users like you and me are connecting with it and using it and providing feedback on how to make it relevant to you and your customers. So green grading is also in review. It's going to get a much needed update as the new physical assessment. I think this part is a little bit, it is less farther along than the rest of the CVA, in part because the Coffee Science Foundation has identified a need to do some additional research and has commissioned some research projects to really understand how green grading can work and should work moving forward. But the physical assessment is really meant to record physical information about green coffee, including its color, defects, moisture content, and size. So similar to that aspect of the current form, a lot of those measures we expect will continue, but will be expanded just like the extrinsic assessment has. So then I think the question that we're all thinking is, who do these changes benefit? This is a coffee systems map that the SCA came out with in 2020. And the goal really is for everybody to benefit, not just coffee buyers, not just consumers, not just traders, not just producers, but everyone along the whole value stream. And again, the intent was to take what was working and what was not working with the current system and expand it so that it was going to be relevant to the whole industry. So here's an example of this at work. This was a research project conducted between the Coffee Science Foundation and World Coffee Research to really understand how is cupping working now. This was conducted midway through the coffee value assessment work that really started in 2019. And this was, this particular research project started a couple of years ago. So the goal of this research project was to understand the connection between the cupping score and ideas about quality. The second was to understand the connection between the cupping score and ideas about value. The third was to understand how specific sensory descriptive attributes affect value and the cupping score. And then finally, assess whether there are geographic or other cultural influences on the above. Basically, is quality understood the same around the world? Is value understood the same around the world? World Coffee Research and the Coffee Science Foundation really wanted to understand that, in part to validate the work of the coffee value assessment team along the way. So coffee samples were sent to cuppers around the world. And these were specially trained cuppers who are coffee professionals in their own markets. And this was the form that was provided. So it's a combination of the 2004 form that provided the SCA cup score. And it was combined with flavor descriptors with the check all that apply. That is the precursor to the new descriptive form. And then the question was asked, is this a specialty coffee in your opinion? And then what are the quality specs? So all of the cuppers received the same coffees in this form, and they were asked to submit their data. So here's the results. Cuppers are not especially consistent with each other. Even those who have been trained by the same standards, the same protocols, there are some cuppers that score the coffee above the mean, and definitely some that score lower. Secondly, cuppers differ in their preferences, but some are very similar in their tastes. So this particular biplot graph shows some consistencies between some of the cuppers and tells us some interesting stories about others. So cuppers 1 and 7 scored similarly. Cuppers 2, 4, 6, and 8 scored some of the same hybrids similarly. Now, cupper number 3, one might say that this cupper was not calibrated or really didn't know what they were doing. Another perspective, however, is that this cupper happens to be a buyer for their market, and they're scoring their preferences very differently from cuppers 1 and 7, in fact, quite opposite, but they're making decisions for their company and their market. Different flavors make a coffee more or less likely to meet quality specifications for different cuppers. So in this particular study, floral was the only flavor that was positive for one group and negative for the other, whereas pretty much everyone agreed about chocolate, even cupper number 3. Earthy is more negative for the green cluster, for example. So when the dots are closer together, the clusters don't differ. And you could say again, cupper number 3 was unreliable, but I think you could also interpret cupper number 3 as being very tuned in to a specific market and a specific set of preferences. I think one of the things that the World Coffee Research and the Coffee Science Foundation team really appreciated about this is, even though we want to believe that a coffee that scores 85 in the UK is going to score it the same, in Guatemala is going to score it the same, in Southeast Asia, our sensory palates don't quite work that way. There's a subjective opinion in the way we taste, and that difference is actually a way that we can contribute to the value of a cup and not necessarily detract it. So back to the example of the painting. If we're only assessing coffee by one score, by one metric, it's not telling us the rest of the story. My friend Peter Giuliano from the SCA used the example of, if I want to buy an espresso, if I want to buy coffees to blend an espresso, I can't just say I want 3 85s. If I get 3 coffees that score 85, they may not blend well together to contribute to the flavors that I need in a cup. So I may want a chocolatey coffee, a floral coffee, and a fruity coffee in order to create the blend that I desire. And yes, I want certain levels of quality, but the other attributes of the cup matter so much more than just the score. So what happens next? And some of this has already happened. So thankfully, the beta version of the protocol, as well as the 3 forms, descriptive, effective, and combined, actually just launched last week. So we have this new cupping protocol as a handbook, but it's also available on the SCA website in the coffee value assessment section. And the beta version of the extrinsic assessment is now available. There's still a call for early adopters. So the early adopters are really people that are committed to use these to provide feedback and to help us make it better. In addition, there are workshops, meetings, trainings happening all over the world. And if you're interested in getting connected with these, there is a section on the Especially Coffee Association's website that lists all of the events that are occurring. And I think this is really just an overview of the coffee value assessment. I found that at a high level, when I first was introduced, it was a little hard to grasp, but once I started doing my own cuppings, the light just went off. It just became so much more practical and applicable to me and my team, and how we assess coffee, and how we make purchasing decisions, and how we make program decisions. We use different parts of the forms, and we use different parts of the protocol and different forms for various aspects of our day-to-day operations. And it's so approachable that yes, there's times where we only need our calibrated team to come in and taste the coffees to help us make purchasing decisions. But other times we want to know what does the general population of our team or our community, what are they experiencing in this coffee? And so we'll just do an effective form and bring in various individuals to taste a coffee and let us know what they think. Just because our highly trained coffee team likes a coffee doesn't mean it's going to be, it's going to sell. And similarly at Toddy, we use these forms for all sorts of coffee tastings. For example, we will be evaluating equipment that we're developing, and we want to understand, how does a coffee taste when we brew it with this piece of equipment versus that piece of equipment? How does the filter that we use impact the flavors in the cup? And so there's really a lot of ways to expand these tools outside of the green buying decision and into all of the ways we taste coffee. So what happens next? Again, the early adopter descriptive and effective assessments have been launched. The extrinsic assessment has been launched in beta. Digital versions of the system, created with the support of multiple partners, are already starting to yield insights of market preferences. And I guess to expand on that, so many of us are using online tools or apps in order to do our cuppings, and now this information is starting to propagate from cuppers around the world that are sharing preferences about what are the flavor attributes, what are the descriptive results, how are they correlating to the coffee scores from the affective. And it's starting to paint a picture of preferences around the world that is incredibly useful for so many of us. And then the research continues, the feedback is continuing, and the alpha and beta work for the physical assessment and the extrinsic assessment and finalizing all of these protocols are forthcoming. So here is where you can get the, yes, it's the coffee value assessment protocol, but this website has all of the resources for the coffee value assessment. There's some really great frequently asked questions that are on the website, and they're even more in depth in this particular publication. So I really recommend that you take some time to look through that. And the early adopter is actually part of this QR code. So that's, again, that's the summary of the coffee value assessment, and we've got some time for questions. So I will do my best to answer them and also point you in the right direction for anything I can't quite answer yet.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Julia. That was a lot. Okay, so let's open the floor for questions. I'm sure there must be some people with some questions out there. Yep.
Thanks, Frank. That's really interesting. I've got two questions. One of them, I've got my Q grade recalibration on Friday. Is this form going to be adopted by CQI for the Q grade system? And how will that work when it comes to calibration, given there's a lot more individual value? The ability to express individual value is more present in the form?
Yeah. Can I answer that one first?
Yeah.
Okay. So the SCA has been in talks with quite a few organizations throughout specialty coffee. For example, the Cup of Excellence and ACE just signed a collaboration agreement with the SCA last week. So there's a lot of really great progress happening with organizations outside of just the SCA. CQI is a very important organization to Specialty Coffee Association, and in fact, Many of the board members are Q graders. Many of the people that developed that are listed in the credits for these guidelines are Q graders. Many of the educators are Q graders. So it's not meant to be a total partition. It's meant to be, how do we work together in order to make coffee better? And that said, these changes take time to adapt and become useful and meaningful. So we anticipate that there's going to be a period of time where we're using a little bit of the coffee value assessment in part of our businesses and day-to-day, and definitely still relying on the work of the CQI in order to continue. The Q grade certification isn't going to disappear overnight, and in fact, the leadership of CQI is very engaged with the SCA to figure out what's the best path forward in order to make coffee better and help coffee professionals and coffee buyers, consumers. All use this information in a way that's going to help their careers. So I definitely think, please, continue on with your calibration. Things are changing, a step at a time, and I think as we continue to move forward with CQI, it's going to become more and more clear of how this will work. Just as it's been with some of the competitions that the SCA runs. It hasn't overnight transitioned to coffee value assessment, but little steps are taking place to start this transition.
And my second question, one of the things I think works really well with the 2004 form is that wherever you are, if you're cupping coffee with like a roaster in London or a coffee farmer in Honduras, it's a very, you can pretty much get a similar score at the end of the day. With the new system, and I think it's a really good system, there's a much more focus on market-driven value and value associated with the extrinsic attributes of a coffee farm. How would this work if you're a person who grows coffee, and how much were coffee growers involved in the process of the development of this system?
Right. There's a couple of parts to that question. I think one of the things that we learned in this process is, even though we thought we were kind of calibrated to each other across the world, didn't quite happen that way. And so this new concept is really acknowledging that it's very, very difficult and not necessarily even desirable to be calibrated universally on what quality is. That said, there are a lot of similarities. It doesn't disappear overnight that something that you perceive as quality, you're trained to perceive a certain level of acidity as quality, and that isn't necessarily going to go away. So I think the goal is that, yes, there's going to be some market preference and individual preference differences, but there's still going to be a lot of alignment on what good coffee is. And so I think we're finding it's more and more applicable. It's less of a change than some of us feared it might be, and the transition is actually more intuitive than we thought. For example, some people are starting to put some of the flavor descriptors in as appendices to their contracts. That, yes, I want something that's in a particular score range, but I want it to have certain flavor descriptors, and I'm requiring certain extrinsic values. And so it's allowing us to kind of look at how we buy coffee and expand upon it to include the things that we are already valuing. We just don't quite know how to quantify. And that's the process that we're trying to evolve towards. Thanks.
that's going to be the scoring that's kind of more like your kind of market or opinions. Then you have the descriptive, then you have the extrinsic. From a consumer perspective, has there been any research or anything kind of noticed in trend in terms of either A, preferences by region from a taste perspective, but also from that scoring attribute, and then B, whether they tend towards valuing the flavors or the attributes that are like certifications, you know, anything that is the kind of extrinsic information?
Sure. I don't have access to that information at my fingertips, but I do know that as more and more of these cuppings are getting put into databases, it's starting to become a little bit more apparent. I think, you know, different consumers have different preferences, both in terms of flavors and the extrinsic, and that's starting to become more and more available as cuppers are putting this information into databases. The SCA website does reference some of these databases. I think Tasteify is one of them, and there's at least another one. They're also in early talks with Cropster, for example. So I think that's one of the big goals is to make this information more available to all of us in the industry.
Thank you. Anybody else got any questions? Oh yeah, at the back.
It's sort of related to what I said earlier as well. When you have a coffee, when it's being roasted, where is the choice on the roasting degree? Where is, if you have an Ethiopian coffee, for example, it's my personal preference that those floral flavors should be got by roasting it delicately, allowing it to be a light roast and allowing those flavors through, where something like an Indian monsoon Malabar for me needs to be darker to get that flavor out. Where does that choice come from on how the coffee's roasted before it's graded?
Sure. So with protocols, you need to start somewhere. And so the protocol for the CVA is very similar to the standard cupping protocol that calls for, you know, the initial assessment for purchasing to be, you know, not necessarily universally, but consistently to be roasted to a similar level so that everyone who receives the coffee can be tasting the same attributes. That said, as a roaster, as you're dialing in your program, you're absolutely going to want to understand how changing the roast profiles is going to impact the cup. So in my roastery, for example, we'll make purchasing decisions when we have very small samples, and so we'll use a predetermined roast for cupping, and then when we get access to a larger quantity, then we will roast the coffee multiple different ways, and often we'll use the combined form, which is actually the descriptive and affective together on the same form. So we can say, for example, roast the coffee 3 different ways, and then assess, okay, what's the flavor intensity, what are the flavors, and then how well do I like it, and use that to compare our 3 samples. And so the forms are very applicable to all sorts of aspects of the day-to-day coffee business. The protocol itself is really designed most specifically for green coffee buying, but then what you do with the coffee is to do your best to make it amazing. And so you can use these forms, just as I do in my company, for all sorts of ways that we're doing, you know, sensory tests on coffee and making decisions for how to put the best products in the market.
Any other questions? Oh, one at the front. Perfect.
Hi. As you mentioned before, how the original SCA was kind of tailored to washed Arabicas. So what's the process, and how are you working towards including extreme other varieties like Robusta and many of the new ones, or different processes into the grading system?
Sure. From my personal experience, the forms and the protocols are very applicable to pretty much any coffee. And in fact, at Toddy, we use it quite a bit for cold brew coffees. So we want to understand how a coffee is going to perform as a cold brew, whereas the 2004 form didn't quite work that way. We had some challenges. We came up with our own form, and then the CVA came out, and we were very grateful. It's like, oh, we've been doing all this work to try to reinvent the wheel, whereas now we've got a new set of tools. I think where the new protocols are really applicable only to Arabica is in the physical. So the physical evaluation, which is still under development, that's going to be different for different coffees. So Robusta, Liberica, Arabica, they have their own intrinsic characteristics, and so comparing them against each other is comparing apples to oranges. So they're starting with the Arabica physical form, and the intention is to expand that into other coffee species as well.
So the plan is to separate it, like forms like that.
Right, for the physical, but the other forms, and I think so. Similarly, the apps eventually will be, here is the data for Arabica. Here is the data for Liberica, for example. That's some time, years off into the future, but that's the intention, is to provide, like these plot charts that I showed. That type of information is incredibly helpful, and as we get, thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of assessments, we're going to be able to take that swatch of color and turn it into a painting, so to speak, of preferences of consumers around the world, both in the types of coffees, the processing methods, etc. I think the Cup of Excellence is a really interesting example of how they've recently transitioned from one competition to three, where they have the different types of coffee separated, the washed, the naturals, and the experimental. They found recently that the experimental coffees, like those of us in some parts of the world, like the strange coffees. And so the strange coffees were continuing to beat out their more traditional counterparts, but not everyone necessarily preferred that. And so having the experimental coffees in their own competition and the washed and the naturals separated really allowed the Cup of Excellence judges to be more meaningful in how they were scoring and judging these competition coffees. And I think similarly, the aim with the coffee value assessment is to be able to understand that different coffees have different attributes that will lead to value. And some of the experimental coffees are incredibly high value to some people, whereas other people have no interest in them at all, and they want their washed coffees and the attributes that they value in the washed coffee they want to know what are the high scoring, what are the best coffees, and the producers that are doing that type of work.
Awesome. Okay, I mean, I've got a couple of questions. We haven't got time really to ask them right now, but I think that's perfect. We're going to take a break now for lunch, but obviously I'm sure we can continue these conversations during lunch and everything else. If there's any of you that are able to join us for drinks later tonight, you will be welcome, of course. But yeah, Julia, thank you so much. It was super, super interesting. Thank you.